Madrid in the late 1600s was a city of dazzling contrasts, a place where gilded palaces and candlelit ballrooms cast long shadows over narrow, winding streets teeming with the forgotten and the oppressed. The carnival season had arrived, a time when the nobility donned elaborate masks and lavish costumes, their laughter and music spilling into plazas that shimmered with lantern light. From the outside, it appeared a city thriving in joy and indulgence, a world of feasts, dances, and intoxicating revelry. But beneath the masks and velvet cloaks, a darker reality pulsed silently, unnoticed by the highborn revelers. The servants, the stable boys, the kitchen maids, and the forgotten underclass who toiled for years in silence, their lives dictated by masters whose cruelty often knew no bounds. These servants moved through the city like shadows themselves, unseen yet ever present. They carried with them the invisible weight of years spent in the cold kitchens, in dark corridors, and under the sharp words or heavier hands of their employers. Their faces, marked by toil and hunger, were rarely seen beyond the scullery windows or behind the palace doors, and their existence was often reduced to obedience and silence. Yet in the quiet corners of Madrid, resentment festered, a slow-burning fire fueled by whispered injustices, stolen wages, and long nights of exhaustion. While the nobles celebrated with music and wine, these same servants nursed injuries both physical and emotional, their hearts heavy with humiliation and dreams of escape, or worse, revenge. The carnival itself was a perfect cover for secrecy. For weeks, the city had been alive with anticipation. Merchants sold intricate masks in every shade of color and every imaginable design, some gilded with gold, others adorned with feathers, while artisans created elaborate costumes that would make any noble's presence unforgettable. The streets echoed with the chatter of townspeople, the clatter of horse-drawn carriages, and the haunting melodies of musicians who wandered from plaza to plaza, filling the night with laughter, excitement, and the intoxicating promise of anonymity. In this time of disguised identities, it was not just the nobles who wore masks. Servants, too, could blend into the throngs, their own appearances altered by fabric and paint, allowing them to move undetected, invisible in plain sight, waiting for the moment when the city's chaos could serve a far darker purpose. It was during these masked nights that Madrid's beauty and horror intertwined so seamlessly that no one could distinguish the two until it was too late. The flickering torchlight illuminated the sharp edges of joy and the hidden corners of despair. Music swelled in grand halls while hunger gnawed in hidden chambers. Nobles laughed, unaware that their every indulgence underscored the oppression of those who had made it possible. In kitchens, in stables, in servant quarters that smelled of smoke, sweat, and despair, plans were whispered between breaths, small conspiracies born out of desperation. The carnival, a symbol of festivity, had become an unwitting stage for the brewing storm. Even as the nobles moved from ballroom to ballroom, their masks transforming their identities, the city itself seemed to hold its breath, sensing a tension that few could name, but all could feel. Servants walked with purpose that night, their movements precise, their eyes sharp with vigilance. Every laugh, every clink of glasses, every carriage passing in the moonlit streets was observed, catalogued, and used to form a mental map of opportunity. They were invisible architects of chaos, knowing the city's rhythms better than the masters who ignored the very hands that fed them, clothed them, and polished their shoes. The air carried a strange mixture of excitement and dread. Perfume from the masked ladies mingled with the acrid smoke of torches and the pungent smells of the city's streets. Music and laughter masked the silent fury building among those who had long been overlooked and undervalued. History, often written from the perspective of the rich and powerful, rarely accounted for the quiet resentment simmering below. In Madrid, this resentment was not simply abstract, it was personal. Every slap, every insult, every act of humiliation contributed to a growing, shared desire for retribution. The carnival, with its chaos and confusion, offered a rare opportunity, a moment when masks could conceal not just faces but intentions, when society's carefully constructed hierarchy could be temporarily ignored or subverted. As night fell deeper and shadows stretched along the cobbled streets, a sense of inevitability crept into the air. The noble families, accustomed to unquestioned authority, could not fathom the storm that brewed in the hearts of their servants. Each mask, each whispered word behind closed doors, and each clink of goblets in celebration was another thread in a tapestry of impending horror. The streets of Madrid, alive with spectacle and music, held secrets that only the keenest eyes could detect. It was a city dancing on the edge of madness, a fragile veneer of gaiety hiding a darkness poised to erupt. By the time the carnival reached its peak, the contrast between opulence and suffering could not have been more stark. Candlelight illuminated the nobility in all their splendor, while shadows cloaked the servants who had become both observers and participants in a drama that history would remember for its brutality. The tension was palpable, a living thing, twisting through the alleys and ballrooms alike. And within this tension lay the seed of a narrative that would shock Madrid and echo through the centuries. A night when masks would hide faces and intentions alike, when laughter would be silenced by screams, and when the oppressed would rise against their oppressors under the cover of celebration. In this city of glitter and shadows, the stage was set. The lights of the masquerade were bright, the music enchanting, and the smiles of nobles radiant. But beneath it all, a storm waited. Shadows moved with purpose, and the unseen eyes of the servants observed every detail, memorizing each corridor, each unlocked door, each distracted gaze. The carnival, so long a symbol of joy, had become a prelude to terror. In the flickering lamplight and behind every mask, Madrid teetered on the edge of a night that would forever change the lives of those who lived it, both master and servant alike. The city, oblivious yet alive with tension, had become a stage where the line between festivity and horror was about to vanish completely. The servants of Madrid were not born with hatred in their hearts, but years of silent suffering and relentless subjugation had slowly carved bitterness into their souls. Kitchens, stables, and servant quarters became breeding grounds for whispered complaints and secretive plotting, spaces where cruelty met endurance and resilience intertwined with desperation. These men and women moved like shadows through the halls of palaces, their every action dictated by the whims of masters who scarcely noticed their existence beyond the duties they performed. Each bruise, each insult, each act of neglect added layers to a growing resentment, a quiet, burning rage that festered behind stoic expressions and bowed heads. To outsiders, the lives of servants appeared insignificant, a backdrop to the splendor of noble existence. Yet behind closed doors, every gesture of disrespect from a master, every stolen coin, every long night spent scrubbing floors or tending to fires became a seed of vengeance. The social hierarchy in Madrid was rigid, unyielding, and often brutal. Nobles expected absolute obedience, and deviation, whether in word, action, or attitude, was met with punishment, humiliation, or worse. The servants' world was one of constant surveillance, where even a fleeting smile or a misplaced glance could provoke wrath. Within this oppressive framework, small acts of defiance or the quiet expression of anger were dangerous, yet they grew steadily, unnoticed, like sparks waiting for wind. Among the ranks of these oppressed workers, certain individuals carried deeper grievances than others. Some had suffered under masters whose cruelty was legendary, men who wielded authority like a weapon, striking with both physical and emotional force. Others had seen family members beaten or threatened, forced into labor at a young age, their innocence stolen by the demands of wealth and power. In whispered conversations and stolen moments, tales of injustice were shared, fanning the flames of collective resentment. Each story, each memory of suffering, became a thread weaving together a network of silent alliances, a tapestry of minds united not by friendship, but by the desire for retribution. Yet it was not only personal grievances that motivated these servants. The disparity between their own suffering and the indulgence of the nobles around them was impossible to ignore. While masked balls overflowed with music, wine, and laughter, the same hands that polished floors, carried heavy trays, or scrubbed grime from stone walls labored without recognition, without reward, and without hope. The contrast was unbearable. It was in these moments that the notion of revenge transformed from a private wish into a tangible plan, a dark, unspoken strategy that simmered quietly, waiting for the opportunity to erupt. Psychology played a subtle yet powerful role in the making of this rebellion. The prolonged exposure to abuse and neglect had not only fueled anger, but shaped cunning and patience. Servants became masters of observation, learning the habits, fears, and weaknesses of their employers. They memorized patterns, which doors were left unlocked, which corridors were rarely patrolled, the timing of guards' rounds, the points where nobles let down their guard in indulgence or intoxication. Every small piece of knowledge became a tool, every secret a potential advantage. What outsiders might perceive as simple obedience was in reality a careful act of survival and preparation, an accumulation of tactical intelligence born from necessity and quiet fury. But beyond practical strategy, there was a profound psychological shift. Long years of subjugation had instilled in these servants a dual identity: the obedient worker before the world, the plotting avenger behind closed doors. Their minds oscillated between fear and courage, between submission and imagination of power. In the small, dimly lit quarters of Madrid, fires burned not only in hearths, but in hearts, kindling visions of what could happen if the rigid hierarchy were suddenly overturned, if those who had once held absolute control were rendered powerless, if the laughter of the elite were silenced by a carefully executed plan born of desperation. This mental transformation was often nurtured in secret conversations and quiet gatherings. In corners of kitchens, behind the thick smoke of fires, or in alleys hidden from the streets, small groups of servants spoke of injustice, of cruelty, and of the fantasies of retaliation. They tested ideas cautiously, observing reactions, refining intentions. Each discussion, each shared experience of suffering, solidified their resolve. These seeds of revenge, though invisible to the outside world, were growing steadily, gaining roots deep in the psyche of those who had long been invisible themselves. By the time the carnival approached, these private grievances had matured into dangerous clarity. The masquerade's promise of anonymity and chaos became the ideal cover, a stage upon which long-brewing resentment could finally manifest. The servants were no longer merely silent observers of the elite's indulgence. They were actors in a drama of impending revolt, armed not with swords alone, but with years of patience, planning, and intimate knowledge of their victims' weaknesses. The psychological groundwork had been laid, and every insult, every humiliation, every act of cruelty endured over decades had accumulated into a precise, lethal intent. Madrid itself seemed oblivious to the storm approaching within its walls. The music of celebration masked the quiet intensity of the servants' preparation. The rustle of silk and the clatter of goblets concealed the careful coordination of revenge. While nobles laughed, feasted, and danced, the oppressed were already imagining the moment when the balance of power would shift, when terror would meet elegance, and when the city's hidden shadows would come alive with deadly purpose. The seeds of revenge had been sown, and they were ready to blossom in the darkness of the carnival night, setting the stage for a horror that would forever stain the memory of Madrid. The night of the carnival arrived with a brilliance that concealed the darkness lurking beneath. Madrid was alive with light and color, the streets thrumming with music, laughter, and the rhythmic echo of countless footsteps. Lanterns hung from every corner, their flickering glow casting playful shadows across stone facades, while the aroma of roasted meats, spiced wine, and sweet pastries mingled with the crisp night air. Nobles appeared as phantoms of extravagance, their gilded masks and flowing fabrics reflecting the brilliance of candlelight in grand halls and open plazas. Every surface sparkled with wealth, every note of music seemed to promise delight, yet beneath the beauty of celebration, tension coiled like a serpent, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. For the servants who had spent years in silence, the carnival was more than a spectacle, it was an opportunity. The anonymity afforded by masks allowed them to move undetected, to blend seamlessly with the crowd, and to observe the rituals of the elite without drawing suspicion. Each servant had memorized the palace layouts, the routines of guards, the placement of valuables, and the habits of their masters. The knowledge accumulated over years now became their weapon, and the chaos of celebration their cover. They watched as nobles danced and drank, oblivious to the danger that had crept silently into their midst. The contrast between the carefree indulgence of the privileged and the simmering intent of the oppressed created a tension that was almost tangible, a dark undercurrent beneath the surface of glittering gaiety. As the night deepened, the carnival reached its peak. Music swelled in every plaza, the air filled with the cries of merchants, the cheer of townsfolk, and the clinking of glasses. Masks hid identities, making it impossible for anyone to distinguish friend from foe, servant from master, joy from malevolence. It was the perfect storm of confusion and distraction. The servants moved like shadows within shadows, slipping through corridors and narrow alleys, each step calculated, each glance measured. Their presence was invisible, their intentions carefully concealed beneath the trappings of costume and festivity. The very elements that made the carnival magical, the chaos, the noise, the masquerade, also became instruments of terror, providing cover for plans that had been nurtured in silence for years. The grandeur of the noble houses offered endless opportunities for infiltration. Ballrooms glittered with chandeliers, the scent of perfumed candles mixing with the faint tang of spilled wine. Masks obscured faces, allowing servants to approach with impunity, while laughter and music drowned out any accidental sounds of preparation. Every corridor and staircase was familiar to those who had worked in silence, and every unnoticed doorway was a potential passage to fulfillment of the dark intent that had taken root in their hearts. As the nobles twirled and swayed, the servants silently mapped the night's possibilities, each movement precise, each choice deliberate. The tension between the celebratory chaos and the careful planning created a cinematic duality, light dancing with shadow, joy mingling with foreboding. The night air carried both excitement and anticipation. Firelight reflected off polished masks, illuminating expressions of delight and oblivion, while in kitchens and servant quarters, torches flickered on faces filled with grim resolve. Conversations once mundane transformed into whispered strategies. Every minor detail, the placement of a chair, the timing of a toast, the opening of a side door, became critical. The servants had rehearsed their roles in secrecy for months, imagining scenarios, adjusting plans, and preparing for every eventuality. The psychological tension was palpable. Their hearts pounded with fear, excitement, and the intoxicating thrill of imminent rebellion. Each second of the festival was a test of patience and timing, a balance between maintaining invisibility and positioning themselves for the moment that would change everything. Outside, the city seemed unaware of the impending horror. Streets overflowed with masked revelers. Musicians wove melodies that enchanted and distracted, and nobles moved through the night with a confidence born of privilege. Yet even in the midst of celebration, shadows lingered. Servants slipped through gaps, moving silently and deliberately, their presence unremarkable to eyes distracted by glitter and music. They watched, calculated, and waited. Their patience was a weapon, their knowledge a tool, and their hatred a force that had grown steadily for years. Every step, every glance, every masked movement brought them closer to the inevitable convergence of festivity and bloodshed. By the time the hour approached when nobles were at their most inebriated, when laughter became louder and dances more frantic, the servants were in position. Masks had concealed their identities, and the carnival's energy had masked their presence. The stage was set for chaos to erupt. In every shadowed corridor, behind every closed door, and within the anonymity of the ballrooms, the servants waited for a signal, for the precise moment when decades of resentment would manifest into action. The anticipation was almost unbearable, yet each servant understood the gravity of the night, the stakes of their plan, and the irreversible consequences of failure. The contrast between the gilded halls and the hidden menace beneath them could not have been more stark. Nobles laughed, drank, and danced, believing themselves safe in the brilliance of their own celebration, oblivious to the forces moving quietly in the background. Every clink of glass, Every note of music and every swirl of silk was a layer of camouflage for the plotting servants, whose hearts beat with a combination of fear, adrenaline, and anticipation. It was a night where light and shadow coexisted uneasily, where the beauty of Madrid's carnival masked a deadly precision, and where the line between joy and horror had begun to blur. As midnight approached, the servants' resolve solidified. The carnival's chaos had provided perfect cover, and the timing of their planned actions had been rehearsed countless times in imagination and whispered strategy. In this glittering city, under the watchful gaze of thousands of revelers, a storm waited to be unleashed. The night of Masquerade, a spectacle of beauty and delight, was poised to become a canvas for violence and retribution, where the long-suppressed fury of the oppressed would finally confront the arrogance and indulgence of the elite. Every mask hid a secret, every movement concealed intent, and every shadow contained the promise of terror. Madrid's grandest night was about to descend into horror. When the first strike fell, it was barely noticeable amid the swirling chaos of the masquerade. Music echoed through the halls, laughter rippled across balconies, and the scent of wine and candle smoke hung thick in the air. Yet within the hidden corners of the palace, the servants moved with deadly precision, their patience and planning culminating in a single, horrifying moment. Years of humiliation, abuse, and simmering anger were transformed into action, a carefully choreographed symphony of vengeance that had been nurtured in secret for decades. Each movement was calculated, each gesture deliberate, and the shock that followed would reverberate throughout Madrid for years to come. The victims, oblivious to the danger, continued their revelry, their masks concealing faces of indulgence and excess. Nobles who had long held power over others were suddenly powerless themselves, caught in the invisible web of strategy that the servants had spun. Panic erupted in seconds. Screams pierced the festive music, glasses shattered, and the clatter of fallen objects echoed through the grand halls. The initial attack was swift and precise, targeting those who had inflicted the greatest cruelty, those whose pride and arrogance had overshadowed their awareness of the servants' quiet resentment. The contrast between the joyous masquerade and the sudden carnage created a surreal, almost cinematic horror that few could comprehend in the moment. The servants worked in silence, their eyes wide with focus, their hearts pounding with adrenaline and fear. They moved like shadows, striking with instruments of convenience, knives from the kitchens, heavy candlesticks, and anything that could become a weapon in a moment of opportunity. The calculated nature of the violence revealed a disturbing intelligence, a meticulous orchestration of chaos designed to maximize shock and minimize the possibility of escape. Nobles stumbled and fell, some grasping at their masks in confusion, others frozen in disbelief, unable to reconcile the sudden terror with the music and laughter that had filled the air only moments before. Within the halls, the scene became a nightmarish ballet of survival and vengeance. Guests who had once laughed and danced were now screaming, struggling, and pleading. Blood marred the polished floors, the vivid red a stark contrast to the glittering fabrics and ornate decorations that had moments ago defined the celebration. Each act of violence was punctuated by the stark silence of intent, the deliberate avoidance of detection by servants who knew the value of timing. The initial chaos was only the beginning, a controlled eruption of fury that allowed the perpetrators to strike with both purpose and efficiency. Some nobles attempted to fight back, though most were unprepared for the intensity and precision of the attack. The servants, fueled by years of oppression and sharpened by observation, anticipated every reaction, countered every movement, and used the environment to their advantage. Staircases became choke points, corridors funneled victims into vulnerable positions, and doors, usually locked to keep servants out, became conduits of terror. The psychological aspect of the attack was as significant as the physical. The nobles' disbelief, their frantic attempts to comprehend the situation, amplified the horror and underscored the servants' dominance in a sudden reversal of power. As the massacre continued, the contrast between the two worlds could not have been starker. The grand halls, previously filled with music, now echoed with screams. The masked figures of indulgence were revealed in moments of vulnerability and terror. Candles flickered over faces twisted in fear, over instruments of vengeance wielded with precision, and over the silent, focused expressions of those who had long endured suffering in silence. The moral inversion of the evening, a night intended for celebration transformed into a tableau of horror, was complete. The servants, once invisible and powerless, now held absolute control over the lives of their oppressors, if only for a fleeting but unforgettable moment. Each strike, each fallen body, reinforced a grim reality. The oppressed had been underestimated, their patience mistaken for weakness, their subjugation assumed to be permanent. The nobles' laughter, their arrogance, and their detachment from the suffering of those who served them had blinded them to the possibility of retribution. Now, in the flickering light of the masquerade, that retribution had arrived with terrifying clarity. The servants' actions were not mindless. They were the manifestation of decades of resentment, meticulously executed to deliver both physical punishment and psychological terror. Even as the initial frenzy subsided, the terror persisted. Survivors stumbled through halls, some hiding behind furniture, some clinging to loved ones, all attempting to comprehend a nightmare that had materialized from what had seemed like ordinary festivity. The perpetrators moved with efficiency, ensuring the completion of their grim objective while avoiding unnecessary exposure. Each second of control, each measured movement, reinforced the reversal of power that the night had wrought. The masquerade, which had symbolized elegance and entertainment, had become a stage for one of Madrid's darkest hours, a night where every mask concealed both a face and a motive, and every shadow became a conduit for vengeance. By the time the chaos reached its zenith, the city itself seemed to hold its breath. Outside, music continued, oblivious to the horror unfolding within. Inside, the servants paused only briefly to ensure that every action had been executed, that every target had been reached, and that their plan, painstakingly formed over years of suffering, had been realized. The silence that followed the slaughter was not peaceful. It was heavy, suffused with the weight of consequences, the gravity of acts long considered impossible, and the lingering terror of a society suddenly made aware of the danger lurking in its own shadows. The night of masquerade, intended to celebrate life, wealth, and social order, had been irrevocably transformed. The servants, who had endured humiliation and hardship, had seized their moment, and the echo of their vengeance would reverberate throughout Madrid for decades. This was not merely a story of violence. It was a testament to the consequences of oppression, the latent power of the overlooked, and the thin line separating celebration from catastrophe. In the aftermath, the glitter of the carnival seemed permanently tarnished, and the image of masks and revelry would forever be entwined with the memory of screams and blood. The morning after the massacre brought Madrid to a stunned silence, the echoes of the night's horror still lingering in the streets and alleyways. News of the carnage spread with a mix of disbelief and terror, carried by trembling servants, frantic townspeople, and the shocked voices of those who had witnessed fragments of the chaos. Streets that had once been alive with celebration were now muted, haunted by the memory of screams and the sight of blood-stained fabrics left behind in abandoned ballrooms and corridors. The grandeur of the carnival had vanished, replaced by confusion, suspicion, and the sudden realization that the city's most intimate spaces of power were no longer safe. Authorities scrambled to respond, though the scale of the horror had left them unprepared. Investigators moved cautiously through the grand halls, their steps echoing in empty corridors where the echoes of panic still lingered. They found bodies strewn across polished floors, ornate masks askew, and the remnants of revelry. A broken glass here, a fallen chair there, marred by the violence of the night. Nobles who had survived the initial onslaught were interviewed, though fear and trauma made their accounts fragmented and inconsistent. Panic mingled with rumors, whispers of secret plots, vengeance, and betrayal spread as quickly as the initial news of the killings. Every servant, every masked figure from the night became a potential suspect in the frantic eyes of the city. The surviving servants moved cautiously, aware that the aftermath of the massacre would be even more dangerous than the night itself. Some attempted to blend back into the chaos, pretending to be as shocked and helpless as their masters expected them to be. Others sought to flee, slipping through alleys and back streets under the cover of dawn, aware that the city's authorities would soon close in. Yet the mask of anonymity could not protect everyone. Suspicion fell unevenly, drawn toward those who had exhibited unusual calm during the chaos or whose absence from noble quarters was noted. Fear, as much as evidence, guided the hands of capture, and the servants' knowledge of the city became both an advantage and a liability. Meanwhile, the city's elite struggled to comprehend the scale of what had occurred. Nobles accused one another, searching for imagined conspiracies within their own ranks, while simultaneously overlooking the very servants who had orchestrated the attacks. Their disbelief was a kind of paralysis. For the first time, they faced the reality that the hierarchy they had relied upon for generations could be violently undermined. Panic, however, soon gave way to calculated action. Guards were dispatched in every direction, checkpoints established at key thoroughfares, and households sealed against further intrusion. Madrid, a city that had prided itself on order and decorum, had become a place of suspicion, fear, and relentless vigilance. The investigation unfolded with the dual intent of understanding what had happened and punishing those responsible. Interrogations were brutal, confessions extracted through both fear and coercion. Whispers of complicity and rumor guided much of the early inquiry, as authorities struggled to separate fact from the panic-fueled imagination of traumatized witnesses. In servant quarters, those suspected of involvement were scrutinized, their movements tracked, and their associations questioned. The city's rigid class structure was on display, revealing both the reliance of nobles on the labor of the lower classes and the vulnerability inherent in underestimating those who served them. Despite the fear and confusion, the servants' meticulous planning had allowed many to evade immediate capture. Their intimate knowledge of hidden passages, secret exits, and the habits of the city's elite offered temporary protection. Some moved like ghosts, leaving no trace beyond whispered rumors of their presence. Others, caught in the web of suspicion or betrayed by a panicked accomplice, were taken swiftly into custody, their silence a testament to both fear and loyalty. The authorities, determined to restore order, employed a mixture of intimidation and legal rigor, yet the story of the massacre refused to fit neatly into the structures of justice. It was a crime born of both opportunity and years of unseen resentment, and the city struggled to comprehend how such deliberate and coordinated violence could have been carried out by those they had considered invisible. As days passed, the magnitude of the event became undeniable. The massacre had left an indelible mark on Madrid, altering perceptions of class, power, and security. Streets remained tense, households wary, and the public deeply unsettled by the realization that servants, those they had long dismissed, were capable of extraordinary and terrifying violence. The cover-up, half-hearted and incomplete, could not erase the memories of that night. Every whispered story, every rumor of complicity, reinforced the chilling lesson. The boundaries of power could be crossed, and beneath the veneer of obedience lay a reservoir of anger that, once unleashed, could not easily be contained. The city, still recovering from shock, had begun to prepare for trials and retribution. Authorities, though unsettled, knew that order had to be restored, that punishment must follow, and that the narrative of control and dominance needed to be reasserted. Yet even as arrests were made and investigations continued, the echo of the massacre lingered in every shadowed corridor, every masked face, and every hushed conversation. The night had changed Madrid, and the servants who had once been invisible had made their mark on history, their revenge leaving a city forever altered, cautious, and haunted. The aftermath of the massacre demanded justice, and the streets of Madrid bristled with anticipation, fear, and curiosity. The city had been forever altered, the shadow of that night lingering in every hallway, alley, and grand ballroom. Nobles demanded retribution, while the authorities scrambled to maintain order and restore the fragile illusion of security. The trial of the servants was a spectacle, one that would be remembered not merely for the acts of violence themselves, but for the profound disruption of societal hierarchy, the exposure of vulnerability, and the public fascination with the unimaginable reversal of power. The accused were brought before judges and inquisitors in chambers heavy with candlelight and tension. Their faces, once hidden behind masks of anonymity, were now laid bare, revealing expressions of stoicism, fear, and, in some cases, grim satisfaction. Testimonies were taken from survivors, witnesses, and other servants, each statement weighed carefully against the growing legend of the night's events. The city, already shocked by the massacre, watched with morbid curiosity as the narrative unfolded, eager to see justice delivered yet horrified by the details of brutality revealed. The trial became a theater of morality, power, and revenge, a public stage on which societal values were examined and tested. As the proceedings continued, the methods of questioning reflected both the era and the horror of the crimes. Investigators employed coercion, intimidation, and psychological pressure to extract confessions, seeking to untangle the complex web of motives, alliances, and events that had led to the carnage. Each servant had their own story, their own justification, and their own account of years of suffering. In the retelling, the city glimpsed the lives of those it had ignored for generations, the hidden anguish that had festered in silence, and the meticulous planning that transformed resentment into lethal action. The trials revealed the intimate knowledge the servants had of their masters' routines, the patience and calculation that had preceded the violence, and the terrifying efficiency with which they executed their plan. Public interest in the trial was overwhelming. Crowds gathered outside courthouses and along streets, straining to glimpse the accused, to hear fragments of testimony, and to witness the administration of justice. The spectacle was both fearsome and enthralling, as people grappled with the incomprehensible idea that those considered powerless had risen in sudden, lethal authority. The stories of betrayal, cruelty, and calculated vengeance captivated the imagination of Madrid's citizens, blurring the lines between moral outrage and fascination. The servants, once invisible, had become central figures in a narrative that questioned the very foundations of power, obedience, and social order. Sentences were severe, reflecting both the shock of the events and the desire to reassert authority. Punishments were carried out publicly, intended to serve as both retribution and warning. Executions, floggings, and other forms of corporal punishment transformed the city into a theater of fear, a grim reminder that vengeance, however carefully plotted, could not escape the consequences imposed by those in power. Yet, even as punishment was meted out, the infamy of the massacre and the notoriety of the servants endured, captured in whispers, rumors, and the dark fascination of citizens who could not look away. The story became legend almost immediately, a tale recounted in hushed tones by servants and nobles alike, a cautionary tale of what could happen when patience, resentment, and opportunity converged. The psychological impact on both the punished and the punishing was profound. Nobles wrestled with their own vulnerability, the realization that their privilege could not protect them from the consequences of long-ignored cruelty. The executed servants, in their final moments, embodied the tension between despair and defiance, their actions forever entwined with the horror they had wrought. History would remember them not only for their crimes, but for the complexity of motives that underpinned the violence, the interplay of oppression, resentment, and human endurance. The trial, while ostensibly a mechanism of justice, also became a mirror reflecting the fragility of social hierarchies and the consequences of underestimating the human capacity for calculated revenge. Even long after sentences were carried out, the memory of the massacre persisted. Madrid's citizens could not forget the horror of the masquerade, nor the servants who had risen in darkness to challenge the very elite who had dominated their lives. The trial had solidified the story in collective memory, embedding it as both a lesson and a warning. The events became part of the city's lore, recounted in whispers, chronicled in documents, and remembered as a night when festivity gave way to terror, when obedience gave way to rebellion, and when the seemingly invisible rose to infamous prominence. In this way, the trials and punishments were both an end and a continuation, a societal attempt to contain horror while acknowledging that some shadows could never be fully erased. The echoes of that fateful night did not fade with the passing of days, weeks, or even years. Madrid carried the shadow of the bloody carnival deep into its streets, corridors, and memories, a chilling reminder of the delicate balance between indulgence and vulnerability, power and subjugation. The massacre had left an indelible mark on the city's psyche, its legend whispered in servant quarters, noble households, and the crowded plazas where townspeople still remembered the terror. Masks, once symbols of elegance and festivity, became reminders of deception, hidden intent, and the darkness that could lurk behind appearances. Every masquerade thereafter was colored by caution, every ball observed with a wary eye, and every servant regarded with subtle suspicion. The events had transformed public perception, reshaping the way the city viewed itself and the fragile social structures that had long governed daily life. Beyond fear, the bloody carnival prompted a profound reconsideration of societal hierarchy. Nobles who survived the night, along with their peers across Madrid, were forced to confront the reality that absolute power could be challenged by those deemed powerless. Servants, for all their long years of subjugation, had demonstrated the terrifying consequences of overlooked resentment. Historical records, diaries, and eyewitness accounts chronicled not only the violence, but also the meticulous planning and intelligence that had gone into executing the massacre. The story became a cautionary tale, studied in hushed conversation, reminding all who heard it that oppression, if left unchecked, could incubate unforeseen and catastrophic consequences. Even centuries later, historians would look back on that night as a turning point in the understanding of social dynamics, justice, and the human capacity for both cruelty and retribution. The city itself bore scars, physical, psychological, and cultural. Palaces and ballrooms that had once symbolized unassailable privilege were forever linked to fear and vulnerability. The architectural grandeur could not erase the memory of the bloodshed that had stained its floors, nor the terror that had frozen noble hearts. In quieter neighborhoods, servant quarters whispered of survival, loyalty, and complicity, embedding the story into the urban fabric. Every alley and corridor, every narrow passage through which the perpetrators had moved, became a reminder that spaces thought to be secure could harbor hidden threats. Madrid, for all its beauty and culture, had been irrevocably changed by the events of that carnival, and the city's identity became intertwined with the lessons learned in the shadow of terror. Culturally, the massacre found its way into literature, chronicles, and oral storytelling, its influence extending far beyond immediate history. Writers and chroniclers, fascinated by the inversion of social roles and the psychological depth of the events, recounted the horror with dramatic flair, embedding the narrative into the collective imagination. The story of masked servants, of carefully plotted vengeance, and of chaos hidden beneath celebration became archetypal, influencing accounts of rebellion, subversion, and the fragility of societal structures in Madrid and beyond. Historians studying social unrest, power dynamics, and class conflict would reference the bloody carnival as a rare and extreme example of how systemic oppression, combined with opportunity, could erupt into devastating violence. Yet the legacy was not solely one of fear and infamy. In private, some servants and townspeople viewed the massacre as a dark but justified assertion of agency, a shocking demonstration that those long ignored were capable of shaping their destinies, however grimly. The narrative blurred moral lines, challenging traditional views of right and wrong, victim and perpetrator. The event became a lens through which society could examine human nature, the consequences of neglecting empathy, and the thin boundary between obedience and rebellion. It remained a story of caution, a haunting reminder that power wielded without accountability can provoke consequences far beyond what the privileged anticipate. Even in modern reflections, the bloody carnival resonates with a sense of fascination and horror. The meticulous planning of the servants, the dramatic reversal of power, and the sheer audacity of the acts continue to captivate historians, writers, and audiences who seek dark historical truths. The night of Masquerade became more than a historical incident. It became a symbol of human resilience, suppressed fury, and the unpredictable consequences of social neglect. Masks, once tools of anonymity and celebration, are now remembered as instruments of deception that allowed a long-simmering vengeance to unfold with shocking precision. Ultimately, the legacy of the bloody carnival endures as both a historical record and a moral parable. Madrid would never forget that night, and neither would history. The massacre serves as a reminder that every society harbors shadows, every hierarchy contains tensions, and every facade of order can be shattered by the invisible forces it underestimates. In the flickering memory of lantern-lit streets, in the whispered tales passed from generation to generation, the bloody carnival lives on, a chilling testament to the enduring power of suppressed anger, the fragility of privilege, and the dark, haunting reality that the oppressed can, and sometimes will, rise. The city's celebration and terror are forever intertwined, a warning to those who would ignore the humanity of those beneath them, and a story that continues to captivate and terrify, centuries after the masks were first donned and the blood first spilled.